Can you believe the recipes that once fed families with love and tradition were forgotten by white America? These African American dishes carried history, flavor, and strength through everyday kitchens. What truths come back to life when we finally remember them? Peanut soup was one of those recipes with roots that stretched back across the Atlantic, carrying African traditions into American kitchens and finding a home particularly in Virginia. Ground peanuts were simmered with broth, onions, and spices until the mixture turned rich and creamy, producing a soup that was hearty enough to be a meal on its own. Grandmothers often leaned on peanut soup during leaner times because peanuts were inexpensive, filling, and nourishing, making them a thrifty substitute for meat. Families would pair it with cornbread or simple biscuits, turning a pot of soup into a spread that fed everyone. The dish was not only practical but also deeply cultural, linking African American kitchens to their heritage in a way that was often overlooked by mainstream America. In the early 20th century, cookbooks written by Black women kept the recipe alive, ensuring it would not disappear entirely. Yet, outside those circles, peanut soup faded from memory, replaced by flashier soups with little history. For those who remember it, the first spoonful brought warmth, pride, and a reminder that food is more than flavor. It is survival, memory, and connection passed down carefully. Sweet potato pie with molasses was more than just dessert. It was a statement of resourcefulness and resilience in rural kitchens. While sweet potato pie itself is an icon of African American cooking, the version enriched with molasses went deeper, adding a dark sweetness that white sugar simply could not match. Families used it because molasses was cheaper, more accessible, and gave the pie a robust flavor that turned a humble root vegetable into something indulgent. Grandmothers often baked these pies for holidays, church gatherings, and Sunday suppers, filling homes with aromas that marked special occasions. The filling was smooth, spiced with cinnamon or nutmeg, and poured into a crust made by hand, while the molasses gave it richness that lingered on the tongue. This pie was a reminder that nothing was wasted, and the best flavors often came from the ingredients overlooked by others. Mainstream America would later embrace pumpkin pie, but in African American homes, sweet potato pie with molasses was the true classic. It deserves to be remembered as a dish that celebrated both thrift and tradition, while carrying forward cultural pride. Fried gizzards were a dish that transformed an often discarded part of the chicken into something beloved. Seasoned, dredged in flour, and fried until crisp, they became a staple across Southern African American communities where wasting food was never an option. Gizzards required patience to prepare, as they needed boiling or marinating to tenderize before frying, but the effort was always worth it. They were crunchy outside, chewy inside, and full of flavor, served with hot sauce or mustard for dipping. Families often made them for gatherings, fish fries, or casual suppers, turning humble ingredients into snacks that could compete with anything bought outside. Children grew up eating gizzards as finger food, learning to savor every bite as proof of their grandmother's skill. While mainstream America often ignored organ meats, Black kitchens embraced them as treasures, finding joy in what others dismissed. Fried gizzards symbolized ingenuity, thrift, and the ability to create comfort from scraps. Though less common today, they remain a recipe worth remembering, not just for their taste, but for the history they represent in kitchens where nothing was ever wasted. Rice fritters with syrup were the kind of quick treat that turned yesterday's leftovers into something sweet and memorable. Cooked rice was mixed with egg and flour, shaped into patties, and fried in a skillet until golden brown. Once stacked on a plate, the fritters were drizzled with cane syrup or sorghum syrup, creating a dish that was crisp, soft, and sticky all at once. This was a recipe born from necessity, showing how grandmothers could transform even the simplest leftovers into something children would rush to the table for. It was common in households where wasting rice was unthinkable, and syrup acted as the perfect topping to give it flavor and charm. Families loved serving them as breakfast, snacks, or even dessert when ingredients were scarce. They were easy, filling, and delicious, proving that creativity in the kitchen could outshine scarcity. These fritters disappeared from memory as packaged cereals and frozen breakfasts became more popular, but they once carried the pride of homemade care. Rice fritters with syrup remind us that sweetness was often homemade, born from ingenuity rather than luxury. Collard green egg rolls may sound like a modern twist, but in truth, they reflect the inventive spirit of African American kitchens in the 20th century. Collard greens, already a staple simmered with smoked meats, were chopped and folded into thin wrappers before being fried crisp. The result was a snack or side dish that blended old tradition with new methods, creating something quick, portable, and delicious. Families enjoyed them as a way to make greens more appealing to children who often resisted eating them boiled. Grandmothers saw the egg rolls as an opportunity to stretch leftovers into another meal, using what was available without wasting. They were also popular at church events and gatherings, where fried finger foods were always welcome. While mainstream cookbooks rarely mentioned such dishes, these egg rolls carried the mark of creativity rooted in heritage. They showed how African American cooking was never static but adaptive, blending cultural memory with new techniques. Though forgotten outside those communities, collard green egg rolls remain an example of how tradition can be reshaped without ever being lost. Okra pickles were a way to preserve one of the most iconic vegetables in African American cooking while creating something tangy and refreshing. Fresh okra pods were packed into jars with vinegar, garlic, dill, and spices, then sealed to keep through the season. These crisp pickles were eaten as snacks, sides, or toppings, bringing a zesty crunch to plates of fried fish, beans, or cornbread. Grandmothers knew the value of canning, and okra pickles were a staple of Black households where food preservation was both necessity and tradition. They were inexpensive, lasted months, and provided flavor when fresh vegetables were out of season. Children often snuck them straight from jars, their tangy bite becoming part of growing up in Southern kitchens. Unlike cucumbers, okra had a unique texture that made the pickles stand out, even if outsiders never appreciated them the same way. They represented both thrift and pride in heritage, tying families back to the land and to Africa, where okra first thrived. Forgotten by mainstream America, okra pickles deserve recognition as a dish that carried memory in every jar. Souse hog jowls were one of those recipes that spoke to the resilience and creativity of African American kitchens. Pork jowls, often overlooked or discarded by wealthier households, were simmered, seasoned, and pickled in vinegar with onions and spices. Once cooled, the meat was sliced thin and eaten cold, often alongside cornbread or greens. It was tangy, savory, and surprisingly refreshing, proof that even the toughest cuts could be transformed with patience. Families saw it as both a snack and a main dish, depending on how far food had to stretch. Grandmothers treated souse as a way to ensure no part of the hog was wasted, keeping alive the tradition of nose-to-tail cooking brought from Africa and perfected in the South. While it may not have reached mainstream popularity, souse carried meaning in communities where resourcefulness defined survival. The vinegar and spice made it last longer than fresh meat, which was crucial in homes with limited refrigeration. Today, it is largely forgotten, but it deserves to be remembered as an emblem of thrift, ingenuity, and pride. Fish chowder with crackers was a quick and dependable dish that brought the sea to the table in less than 15 minutes. Made with fish, potatoes, onions, milk, and sometimes a little pork fat for richness, it was stretched further by crumbling soda crackers right into the pot. This turned a simple soup into a filling meal that warmed families and kept bellies satisfied. Grandmothers leaned on fish chowder because it was inexpensive, flexible, and adaptable to whatever fish could be caught or bought cheaply. It was particularly common in coastal African American communities where fishing was both work and sustenance. The crackers acted as a thickener, proof that resourcefulness was always present in these kitchens. Children loved dunking extra crackers into their bowls, while adults appreciated the comfort of something hot and hearty after long days. Mainstream America celebrated clam chowder, but fish chowder with crackers remained a quieter dish, treasured in Black households for its simplicity. It is a recipe that reflects the ingenuity of communities who made nourishing meals with what was available, never wasting a thing. Turnip green soup was one of those humble dishes that defined comfort and thrift. Turnip greens, often considered less desirable than collards, were simmered slowly with smoked pork or ham hocks until tender and flavorful. The broth became rich and savory, while the greens themselves absorbed every bit of seasoning. Families often crumbled cornbread into the soup, turning it into a hearty meal that cost almost nothing but filled stomachs with warmth. Grandmothers knew the importance of using every part of the garden, and turnip greens, far from being waste, became nourishment that carried households through lean times. This soup was common in southern kitchens where nothing was overlooked, and flavor was built from patience rather than expense. Children grew up associating its smell with home, even if they wrinkled their noses at eating greens. It was proof that survival food could be deeply comforting when cooked with care. Though overlooked outside of Black communities, turnip green soup remains an enduring example of resourceful cooking that deserves a place in memory as much as collards or beans. Batter-fried oysters were a dish that turned fresh or canned seafood into something golden and irresistible. Oysters were dipped in seasoned batter, fried quickly in hot oil, and served crisp on the outside while tender inside. They were staples of fish fries and coastal gatherings where seafood was plentiful and frying brought communities together. Grandmothers often prepared them for special occasions, knowing they could feed many with just a bucket of oysters and a pot of oil. Children loved the crunchy exterior, while adults enjoyed the briny flavor that lingered after each bite. Fried oysters were also symbols of celebration, appearing at reunions, church events, and holidays when families wanted to treat themselves. While mainstream America often associated oysters with fine dining, African American kitchens turned them into communal food, affordable, shareable, and full of joy. Over time, they became less common in everyday meals, replaced by other fried favorites, but they remain unforgettable. Batter-fried oysters deserve to be remembered as one of those recipes that turned gatherings into something special, a dish that carried the spirit of community in every bite. Corn dodgers were once the everyday food that field workers and travelers trusted to get them through long, demanding days. Made from cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, they were shaped into small cakes and fried in a skillet or baked until sturdy. Their dense texture made them portable, satisfying, and able to last without spoiling, which mattered when refrigeration was rare. Workers slipped them into pockets to carry into fields, mines, or on the road, knowing a few bites could keep hunger away for hours. Families paired corn dodgers with beans, greens, or stews, while children ate them with syrup or molasses if it was available. They were not fancy, but they were practical, inexpensive, and deeply tied to Southern food traditions. White America often ignored them, but African American kitchens preserved them as part of a culture of thrift and survival. Corn dodgers proved even humble bread could sustain families. Molasses glazed sweet potatoes transformed a simple root into a dish that tasted far richer than its modest ingredients suggested. Sweet potatoes were sliced, simmered, or baked in molasses until tender, sticky, and beautifully caramelized. The molasses added depth, balancing natural sweetness with a darker, richer flavor that sugar could not match. Families prepared this dish often because both ingredients were cheap, easy to store, and widely available even in hard times. Grandmothers relied on it for Sunday dinners, holidays, and moments when they wanted comfort without extravagance. Children loved the sticky, candy-like taste, while adults appreciated its nourishing quality. Served alongside beans, greens, or roasted meat, molasses glazed sweet potatoes gave balance and warmth to the table. The dish also carried cultural echoes from Africa, where roots and syrups were long combined. Though forgotten in many modern kitchens, it remains a proud reminder of thrift, resourcefulness, and heritage passed through generations. Chitterling loaf was a recipe that reflected the creativity and endurance of kitchens where wasting food was never an option. Made from pig intestines, chitterlings were scrubbed, boiled, and seasoned before being pressed into a loaf pan to set. Once cooled, the loaf could be sliced thin for sandwiches or pan-fried into filling portions. It was inexpensive and dependable, proof that sustenance could come from even the least celebrated cuts. Families turned to chitterling loaf during lean seasons, and while it lacked glamour, it carried the unmistakable flavor of survival. Grandmothers treated it with patience, seasoning carefully to ensure every slice was flavorful. Children learned that even humble meals carried dignity, and households valued the thrift behind it. White America often rejected foods like this, but black kitchens preserved their worth. Chitterling loaf stands as more than food. It was resilience served on a plate, strength born out of necessity. Okra succotash was a bright and hearty dish that embodied both Native American and African American traditions in one pot. Okra, corn, and beans formed its foundation, each ingredient adding texture, sweetness, or substance to the mix. Families cooked it in summer when gardens overflowed, serving it as both a side and sometimes the centerpiece of a meal. Its beauty was in its flexibility, allowing cooks to add tomatoes, onions, or smoked pork if those ingredients were nearby. It was nutritious, quick, and filling, but also deeply symbolic, tying families to the land and to shared history. Grandmothers passed the recipe down, teaching children how a dish could be more than sustenance. It could be identity. While not every child loved vegetables, they grew up recognizing succotash as tradition. Forgotten by mainstream cookbooks, it endures as proof that blended roots created something lasting. Okra succotash remains a plate of heritage and resilience. Rabbit stew was a rural dish born of necessity, created in kitchens where hunting often filled the gap that markets could not. Rabbits were abundant, free to catch, and offered enough meat to stretch into a family meal. Stewed slowly with onions, carrots, and whatever herbs could be foraged, the dish was earthy, flavorful, and deeply comforting. Grandmothers leaned on rabbit stew when times were lean, knowing it cost little more than time and care. Families gathered around bowls of it with cornbread on the side, turning survival food into something that felt like a feast. For children, it was often their first taste of wild game, teaching them that the land could provide if you knew how to work with it. Rabbit stew held cultural significance too, tied to rural life and traditions of hunting that sustained generations. While it may seem unusual today, it was once a trusted dish that kept families going. It deserves to be remembered as a symbol of self-reliance and creativity in African American cooking. Brown sugar pound cake was a dessert that became a beloved feature of church socials, family reunions, and Sunday dinners. Unlike its plain cousin, this version used brown sugar, which gave it a deeper, almost caramel-like flavor that made every slice memorable. The cake was dense, moist, and simple to prepare, yet it carried the weight of tradition in every bite. Grandmothers baked it often, knowing it would always be welcomed wherever it was shared. Families loved gathering around with plates of pound cake, sometimes topping it with fruit, cream, or nothing at all. Children looked forward to the sweetness, while adults appreciated how it paired with coffee after a meal. It was the kind of cake that could be made from pantry staples, without the need for expensive ingredients. Brown sugar pound cake also carried echoes of resourcefulness, showing how substitutions created something even better than the original. Today, it is often forgotten outside of handwritten recipe books, but it deserves to be celebrated as a dessert that built community through sharing. Beni seed cookies were small, simple, and packed with history that stretched back to West Africa. Beni seeds, known today as sesame seeds, were brought across the ocean and planted in southern soil where they thrived. Mixed into cookies with sugar, butter, and flour, they became a sweet treat with a nutty, distinctive flavor. Grandmothers often baked them in low-country kitchens, particularly in South Carolina and Georgia, where the tradition was strongest. Families treasured them as symbols of resilience, proof that cultural memory survived despite hardship. Children loved their crisp texture and slightly sweet taste, while adults enjoyed the connection they carried. Beni seed cookies were often given as gifts or served at gatherings, turning simple ingredients into something with meaning. While mainstream America forgot them, African American families passed the recipe down through generations. Every bite carried history, reminding people of where they came from and the roots that nourished them. They were more than cookies. They were heritage preserved in flour, sugar, and seeds, a sweet reminder of resilience and cultural pride. Pork ribs with vinegar-mop were a barbecue style that prioritized tang over sweetness, setting them apart from other approaches. Instead of heavy sugary glazes, these ribs were basted again and again with a vinegar-based sauce while cooking slowly over heat. The result was tender, juicy meat with a sharp, mouth-watering bite that cut through the richness. This method came from African-American pitmasters who valued flavor and thrift, making the most of less expensive cuts. Grandmothers and uncles would gather families for cookouts, where the vinegar mop was passed around with brushes, soaking the ribs until they dripped with flavor. Children ran around playing while the smell of smoke and vinegar filled the air, creating memories as lasting as the meal itself. These ribs carried tradition, showing that barbecue was as much about culture and technique as it was about food. White America later popularized sweet sauces, but the vinegar mop remained a hallmark in Black communities. Forgotten by many, it stands as a reminder of flavor born from patience, heritage, and shared tables that built community. Molasses water was a drink that proved refreshment did not need to be expensive or complicated. On hot days, grandmothers would stir a spoonful of molasses into cold water, creating a slightly sweet, mineral-rich drink that cooled the body and soothed the spirit. It was simple, nourishing, and far cheaper than sodas or store-bought beverages. Families relied on it during long summers in the fields or after days of hard labor, when hydration mattered more than luxury. Children often grew up sipping molasses water, their bodies strengthened by the iron and nutrients it carried. It was one of those practical recipes that came from making the most of what was on hand, yet it held a certain comfort in its familiarity. Unlike modern sports drinks, molasses water had no marketing or fancy label, just usefulness and care. Though it has been forgotten today, it once represented thrift, tradition, and the everyday wisdom of Black households. Molasses water deserves to be remembered as proof that even the simplest drink could sustain generations with strength and pride. Cabbage and cornmeal dumplings were a dish that blended greens and grains into something hearty, thrifty, and deeply satisfying. Chopped cabbage was simmered until tender, seasoned with smoked meat or fatback, and then dumplings made from cornmeal were dropped into the pot. The dumplings soaked up the flavor of the broth while adding bulk to stretch the meal further. Families often relied on this dish during hard times, when vegetables and meal were easier to come by than meat. Grandmothers passed it down because it filled stomachs without costing much, and children grew up knowing it as a regular supper. The combination of cabbage and dumplings reflected both resourcefulness and heritage, tying African-American kitchens to traditions of making plenty out of little. While mainstream America never paid it much attention, in Black households it symbolized survival and comfort. It was proof that with patience and creativity, a pot of humble ingredients could feed many. Though forgotten today, cabbage and cornmeal dumplings remain a powerful memory of resilience, pride, and ingenuity in the face of scarcity. Roasted peanuts in paper bags were one of the simplest but most loved street foods in many Black neighborhoods. Vendors sold them hot, freshly roasted, with the smell drifting down sidewalks and pulling children and adults alike toward the stand. The peanuts were inexpensive, portable, and satisfying, making them an ideal snack for people on the go. Grandmothers often sent children with a few coins to pick up a bag after school or church, and the warmth of the peanuts became part of memory. They were eaten straight from the bag, sometimes salted, sometimes plain, but always shared among family and friends. This small treat represented more than food. It was a piece of community life, a reminder of resilience and joy, even in modest circumstances. Though mainstream America overlooked such traditions, roasted peanuts in paper bags stayed in memory as comfort tied to place and people. Hog cracklings with hot sauce were proof that no part of the hog went to waste in African-American kitchens. Made from fried pork skins, they were crispy, salty, and addictive, especially when tossed in homemade pepper vinegar. Cracklings were often cooked in large iron pots, with families gathering to watch as pieces puffed up and turned golden. The addition of hot sauce elevated them, adding tang and fire that balanced the fat and crunch. For children, they were a fun snack eaten by the handful, while adults paired them with greens, beans, or cornbread. This dish reflected thrift and tradition, using what others discarded to create something unforgettable. Cracklings carried the taste of gatherings, hunts, and hog killings, connecting generations to both land and heritage. Though later dismissed as unhealthy, they remain a reminder of skill, care, and flavor, drawn from simple, overlooked ingredients transformed with love. Sweet potato pone was a baked dish that turned an everyday root into a dessert that was comforting, filling, and steeped in tradition. Grated sweet potatoes were mixed with molasses, nutmeg, and brown sugar before being baked into a pudding that was both hearty and sweet. The dish was inexpensive yet rich in flavor, and it often appeared on tables during holidays or after Sunday dinners. Families treasured it because it was easy to prepare with common pantry ingredients, and the result was a dessert that satisfied everyone. Children loved its sticky sweetness, while adults enjoyed the spiced aroma that filled the kitchen. Sweet potato pone tied African American households back to both African and Southern roots, reflecting history and creativity in every slice. Forgotten in many cookbooks today, it deserves to be remembered as a recipe that brought comfort, warmth, and a sense of celebration into modest kitchens. Devil's Food chocolate loaf was a dessert that carried weight and presence at special gatherings. Unlike lighter cakes, this one was rich, dark, and deeply flavored, often made when families wanted to mark a meaningful occasion. Cocoa was mixed with butter, eggs, and sugar to create a dense loaf that could be sliced thick and shared widely. Grandmothers baked it for church socials, holidays, or birthdays, making sure it was perfectly moist and decadent. Children anticipated each slice, savoring the bold chocolate flavor that felt like a luxury in homes where sweets were often simple. Adults appreciated the sense of indulgence that came with a recipe made for moments of togetherness. While white America often popularized lighter sponge cakes, Devil's Food loaves thrived quietly in African American kitchens as desserts with depth. They remain a symbol of celebration and pride, proof that richness could come from simple hands. Fried croaker fish was a common dish in Black coastal communities where fishing was a way of life. Croaker was inexpensive, plentiful, and easy to catch, making it a natural choice for weeknight suppers and family gatherings. Cleaned and seasoned with salt and pepper, the fish was coated in cornmeal and fried until golden and crisp. The result was flaky inside, crunchy outside, and always best eaten hot from the pan. Families often paired croaker with coleslaw, grits, or cornbread, turning a simple fish into a memorable meal. Children grew up with the sound of oil sizzling and the smell of fried fish as part of their household rhythms. It was a dish that connected people to both the water and the land, proof of self-reliance and skill. Though forgotten outside coastal regions, fried croaker remains a reminder of affordable, flavorful seafood made with care. Old-fashioned rice gravy was one of those dishes that showed how far creativity could stretch drippings into something hearty. Instead of serving gravy over potatoes, African American families often poured it over rice, which was cheaper, more filling, and tied deeply to cultural roots. Meat drippings were simmered with flour, onions, and broth until thick, then ladled over hot bowls of rice. It was quick, thrifty, and flavorful, turning scraps into meals that fed families well. Grandmothers made it often, knowing that a pot of rice and a pan of gravy could satisfy even on the leanest days. Children enjoyed it for its savory richness, while adults valued its practicality. The dish carried history too, linking African traditions of rice cultivation to American soil. Though forgotten in most modern kitchens, old-fashioned rice gravy remains a recipe worth remembering, proof that comfort often comes from the simplest combinations. Pickled collard stems were a recipe that revealed the resourcefulness of kitchens where nothing was wasted. After collard greens were cooked, the stems were saved, chopped, and packed into jars with vinegar, salt, and spices to create a crisp, tangy snack. They were inexpensive, easy to make, and lasted for weeks, adding flavor when fresh vegetables were scarce. Families ate them alongside beans, cornbread, or meat, and children sometimes snacked on them straight from the jar. The pickling transformed tough stems into something bright and refreshing, proof that overlooked parts of plants could still nourish. Grandmothers passed down the practice, teaching younger generations the value of thrift and preservation. Pickled collard stems rarely appeared in cookbooks, yet they were staples in African American homes. They symbolized survival, creativity, and the ability to turn scraps into something delightful. Today, they deserve recognition as a forgotten gem of resilience and flavor. Homemade molasses beer was a lightly fermented drink that families created from what they had on hand. Made with molasses, water, and yeast, it was simple, inexpensive, and refreshing, offering both sweetness and tang. African American households often relied on it during gatherings or hot days when store-bought sodas were out of reach. It was not heavily alcoholic, but carried a slight fizz that made it special, especially for celebrations. Grandmothers and uncles prepared it in jars or jugs, setting it aside to ferment just enough before serving. Children sometimes got a sip, delighting in the bubbles, while adults valued its practicality. This drink was part of a long tradition of making beverages at home, proof that creativity could replace what money could not buy. Though rarely seen today, homemade molasses beer reflects both thrift and culture, a reminder that refreshment once came from the kitchen. Wild berry cobblers were desserts that grew directly from the land, made with whatever berries could be foraged nearby. Blackberries, dewberries, or mulberries were mixed with sugar, topped with dough or biscuit crust, and baked until bubbling. They were quick to prepare, often assembled in less than 20 minutes, and served warm with cream if available. Families loved them because they required no special ingredients, just what the fields and woods provided freely. Children ran out to gather berries in baskets, returning with purple-stained hands that told the story of summer. Grandmothers used those berries to create cobblers that felt like celebrations of abundance, even in lean times. They were sweet, rustic, and comforting, eaten at both ordinary suppers and Sunday gatherings. Wild berry cobblers were proof that joy could be baked from what nature offered. Forgotten in many kitchens now, they remain timeless reminders of resourcefulness. Beef neck bone gravy was a dish that showed how flavor could be coaxed from even the humblest cuts. Neck bones, inexpensive and often overlooked, were simmered with onions, broth, and flour until they released deep richness. The result was a thick, savory gravy that was poured over rice or biscuits, turning scraps into feasts. Families relied on this dish when money was tight, as neck bones were cheap but still full of taste when cooked slowly. Grandmothers taught younger generations how to stretch meat like this, making sure nothing was wasted. Children loved the hearty flavor poured over fluffy biscuits, while adults appreciated the thrift and satisfaction it brought. This dish connected families to a tradition of making plenty from little, proving that resourcefulness was as important as seasoning. Though it has faded from many kitchens, beef neck bone gravy deserves remembrance as comfort born of creativity. Share which of these lost recipes stirred a memory for you in the comments. Then like the video and subscribe so we can keep bringing forgotten flavors back to your table.